So there's this exclamation in science when new discoveries are had, right? So, and it used to be that in cartoons or in shows, they would use it all the time, right? It would be like Eureka, right? Um, Gravity is discovered. Eureka! Electricity. Eureka! We find out that sound and light move in waves. Eureka! It was like it was constant. Like I remember as a kid hearing Eureka all the time. We hardly hear it anymore. Like I had to really think about it. I looked it up. Like Eureka, right? Anyway, doesn't matter. Today, this Sunday, we're looking at and celebrating, remembering the Epiphany and the baptism. So I was online. I was on Facebook because I belong to a couple of minister sites, right, where we have conversations. And someone said, "What are you doing this Sunday?" Because yesterday was Epiphany, and today is marked in the lectionary as baptism of Jesus. And someone said, "Oh, I never do Epiphany unless it falls on the Sunday." I was like, "Well, that doesn't work. Like for me, anyway." And they said, "How do you do Epiphany and baptism at the same time?" Well, you're going to find out right now how you do that. So I think in church land, I had one of our profs at AST. He was a music prof. He taught us how to. Well, he tried to teach us how to sing, and he taught us different pieces of chanting and things like that. He used to talk about things being different in like the real world and in church land. Well, in church land, I don't think we have eurekas. We don't have eureka moments. We have epiphany moments. We have moments in our lives as people of faith where we should be walking through going, "Epiphany! Epiphany!" I walk down the street and I look and in that moment, there is something that just screams God at me. Just scream, like, you see something just so beautiful. I mean, think about every sunset you've seen. Every sunset. I've started collecting pictures of sunsets that people post from different parts of the world, and every one of them, we know every one of them is the same thing. Right? Every single one of them, the sun is going down over the horizon, and it disappears, it disappears from our sight until tomorrow when it's going to rise again. We know that every sunset, the same thing is happening, but each one is so unique. And some of them, you just, like, I don't know about you, but there have been times I've been driving down the QEW, and there in front of me is this sunset that is absolutely stunning. And I look at it and I go, man, God is just such an incredible artist. Such an incredible, like all of the hues and the colors, and I know, like I just said, that light it moves in waves. So I know it's just waves of energy going through the air, and I know that. But at that moment, I just go, that is evidence of God's presence in my life at this very moment. And at that moment, I'm driving along, Epiphany! God is right there. The first Epiphany. So we've come to use Epiphany for a whole lot of things, right? like we have epiphanies all the time in our lives, and so much so that the word has kind of lost a little bit of its meaning. Because I think that for us, for Christians, for people of faith, an epiphany is a moment when we recognize God's presence in our lives. When we recognize that something incredible is happening. On that first epiphany, the Magi who traveled to visit the Christ child, and whether it was when he was a baby or when he was 2 years old, I don't know, I don't care. I don't know, I don't care. So we'll just get that out of the way first. But when the Magi made that trip, they get there, they're confronted with the Christ child, and what do they know in that moment? They know Emmanuel. And I don't mean the name, I mean Emmanuel. They know God with us. In that moment, in that presence, they see the child, and from that child, they know that God is with us. Emmanuel. That is Epiphany. And so we are gifted. We are gifted throughout our lives to be able to see that presence made real in our life. It could be a sunset or a sunrise if you get up that early. I don't. Well, actually, there's been a couple of times, but they were anomalies. It could be a sunset, sunrise. It could be, it could be something as mundane as the smell of a perfectly baked loaf of bread. It could be the taste of a perfectly prepared roast beef dinner. It could be the look in your spouse's eye that morning when you wake up. You just look over and you go, oh my God, you're here. It could be holding a child. It could be, think of any of those moments that we really, sadly, we let them go past without notice all too often. That piece of music that you've heard it a million times, but one day you're listening to it and you go, oh, Jesus, you've caught me. Epiphany. God is present in your life at that, God is always present in your life. But the great thing about epiphanies is that that's when you notice that God is present. I was going to say that an epiphany is when we recognize something, when we recognize that presence. But an epiphany is also a moment when God chooses to reveal something to you. God chooses at that moment to open your open your eyes, to introduce yourself into something of God's being that you did not know before. And that's what happens at that first epiphany. The Magi recognize Emmanuel, God with us. This is a moment in history. A moment in history when God is now revealing something of God's self in that moment. Before this, before the birth of Jesus, God was all-powerful, sitting up in heaven, could do anything, could control anything, could master the weather, could master everything. God was untouchable, and without match. There was nothing that could compare to God. until Jesus is born. Because when Jesus is born, all of us compare to God. When Jesus is born, God is no longer all-powerful, sitting up in heaven, controlling everything. God is a child, vulnerable, in need of our support. That is something new that is revealed on that first Epiphany, in the birth of Jesus. That is a whole new side to God's character that we have never encountered, that humanity has never encountered before. But now, once we've experienced that, humanity cannot continue on the way that we did before. We need to relate to God in a different way. Okay, there's Epiphany. Jump ahead 25, 30 years. Jesus is he's trying to figure out what he's about. And so now he's walking along the Jordan. He sees John. There's a crowd of people. John's had some sort of a vision that this is going to happen, right? He says that soon there's going to be one who's going to come along whose sandals I am not fit to tie. So John knows that something's happening right at that moment in history. Right then, there's John, and John's got a sense. Jesus walks along, and he comes and does something that is totally. So John knew something was going to happen, but this is not what John thought was going to happen. Because Jesus walks up to John and says, "Baptize me." And John knows who it is. He knows. Like it's, so they were cousins, we're told, and so there's a relationship. But I got cousins, and trust me, they're not Emmanuel. Okay, but here, Jesus walks up and says to John, "Baptize me." And John says, "No, you should be baptizing me." And Jesus says, "That comes later. There's stuff that's going to happen. But right now, in order for everything else to unfold, this has to happen. I have to be baptized." And so now that raises all kinds of questions for us. As Christians, all kinds of questions, because there is a theology that says that baptism is the cleansing of sin. Right? That's what we do. We die to sin, so why is Jesus being baptized? If we believe that Jesus is without sin, if we believe that Jesus is indeed Emmanuel, God with us, then why does Jesus need to be baptized? Because Jesus has to be seen, like understood, known. Jesus has to be known as part of that community that is humanity. So now, as Emmanuel, God is revealing something new about God's self. That God is God needs to be in relationship with us. God's life, if we can understand God as having a life that transcends time, and but if we can understand that God has a life, God's life, and this is crazy to think about. Crazy to think about, because God is, well, creator of everything. God's life is incomplete without us. Not only that, not only is God's life incomplete without us, God's life is incomplete without you. God's life is incomplete without you. Epiphany. This is something that God is revealing to us at that moment of Jesus' baptism. But then Jesus is baptized for another reason, and that is for our benefit. Because Jesus, his baptism, is the beginning of his ministry. Jesus, so for the previous 30 years, Jesus is doing whatever Jesus did. Right? He probably learned his father's craft. He probably studied Torah. He probably did all kinds of things. But at the moment of his baptism, Jesus begins his ministry, his earthly ministry. And that ministry he unpacks for us. I mean, remember, during Advent, we heard the Magnificat. So Mary kind of unpacks it for us beforehand. But soon, Jesus will unpack it again for us in Luke 4, when he sits in the synagogue and opens the scroll of Isaiah and talks about release for the prisoners and feeding the hungry and all of those pieces. So Jesus will unpack it. But today, the day of his baptism, is the day when he comes out of that water. He comes out of that water, and that's when his ministry begins. That's when he takes on that intentional ministry. He comes out of that water, and what did the word say? He watched as a dove descended upon him, and the words, "This is my son, in whom I am well pleased." I don't know if whom I love, with him I am well pleased. Other places it says, like, there's an addition, and it says, "Listen to him." So the question of what, so this beginning of his ministry that starts at baptism, that now reveals again another piece of who God is. So Scripture, Deuteronomy, and the Exodus, and so those scriptures told us that God has a preferential option for the poor, which is a theological term coming to us from liberation theology. But God is concerned for widows and orphans. God is concerned for the sick. This is all scriptural. But now Jesus, as Emmanuel, takes that mission into his own hands and starts to address all the needs of society, but also the needs of individuals. And that begins at his baptism, and that not only is that part of the beginning of his ministry, but it is also a revelation of who God is. So now, we are all baptized. Well, most of us are baptized. And in that baptism, something happened. The first time I did a baptism at Silver Spire, which is the church I was at before coming here, I actually had the children sort of sit around and and after the baptism I said, "Did you see it?" And they were like, "What?" I said, "Did you see the Spirit? Did you see the Spirit descending?" And they said, "No, we didn't see that." We don't necessarily see it. But at our baptism, the Spirit descends. The Spirit, we take on that Spirit of Christ. We take on that mission of Christ. Now that's easier to see when an adult is baptized. And that's why, as a church, when we baptize an infant, we have a confirmation. Because at confirmation, the child who has been baptized takes on that ministry, takes on that work, takes on that vow. Says, "Yes, I agree. to having this be my life. And my life is now Christ's life. Each of these pieces tells us something about God. Each of these pieces tells us something about God. But it also tells us something about ourselves. It tells us something about ourselves. So God is constantly, and I confess that as I say this, I don't always live it. I don't. God is constantly revealing God's self to us. God is constantly offering us these little epiphany moments, and sometimes really big epiphany moments. Always. And we are invited, as Jesus said, to have eyes that see and ears to hear. God is constantly letting us know who God is. But in so doing, while God is doing that, God is also revealing to us who we are, who we are called to be. We are called to be in communion with God. Because as true as it is that God's life is incomplete without us, I will profess, confess, and proclaim that our lives, that my life, is incomplete without God. That's Epiphany and baptism. That's the beginning of our life of faith. And that is our ongoing life of faith. Thanks be to God.